Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on procurement management documents. Part 4. Now we take a closer look at the fixed price incentive fee type of contract and how to calculate the contract value or total price paid. This is a popular type of contract, especially with government agencies, because it provides an incentive to the seller to keep costs under control, but also allows some flexibility in total costs and shares the risk of increased costs and shares the benefits of reduced costs. First, we need to start with some vocabulary that can get a bit confusing. Target cost is the target for the sum of all of the seller's legitimate costs to fulfill the contract. It is not the target of the total amount that the buyer would pay. It's just the costs part, not including any profit for the seller. The target fee is the target amount of the fee or profit to be paid to the seller. Together, the target cost and the target fee equal the target price, which is the target of the total amount that the buyer would pay to the seller. The ceiling price is the maximum amount that the buyer will pay, the whole price, including costs and incentive fee. The share ratio defines how the buyer and seller will share any cost savings or cost overruns. It's measured relative to the target cost. The ratio is expressed with the buyer's percentage listed first. For an 80-20 share ratio, 80% of any cost savings are retained by the buyer, and 20% are awarded to the seller. If the work goes over the target cost, then 80% of the extra costs are paid by the buyer, while the seller has to pay for the other 20%. Actual cost is the actual sum of all the seller's costs under the contract. Actual fee is the actual amount of incentive fee that is paid by the buyer to the seller after accounting for any shared cost savings or overruns. Actual profit is the seller's actual profit expressed as a percentage. And actual price is the actual total amount of money that the buyer pays to the seller under the contract. Let's go through an example. Suppose you're the buyer and you have a project that you want to outsource. And based on your estimates, including, let's say, some independent cost estimates, you determine that the project should cost $1 million. So you set that as the target cost for your contract. Let's further suppose that the going rate for profit on a project like this is about 10%. So you set the target fee at $100,000. That means the target price is $1.1 million. Let's also suppose that based on ranges of your independent cost estimates, you determine that the most you should have to pay for this project is $1.3 million. So you set that as your ceiling price. Let's say that your cost estimates also indicate that there's a fair amount of uncertainty regarding these costs, within these ranges anyway, so you decide to bear most of the cost of any cost overruns. So you set the share ratio at 80-20, meaning that you will pay 80% of any cost overruns and keep 80% of any cost savings. However, this does provide the seller with a 20% incentive to reduce costs. So much for the contract terms. Now let's take a look at the actuals. Let's suppose that thanks to some creative cost reduction methods on the part of the seller, that the actual cost, that is the sum of the seller's costs, comes to $900,000, a $100,000 cost savings. That means that the seller gets their $100,000 fee plus 20% of the $100,000 savings for a total actual fee of $120,000. The actual price, the total amount that the buyer pays to the seller, is the actual cost plus the actual fee for a total actual price of $1,020,000. You can then calculate the actual profit as the actual fee divided by the actual cost. That is $120,000 divided by $900,000, which comes to 13%. It's not bad, especially if it's only a 6-month project. On the other hand, what if the project costs more than expected? Suppose the actual cost, the sum of the seller's costs, comes to $1.1 million. The actual fee is then the target fee of $100,000, but reduced by 20% of the $100,000 cost overrun. The actual fee is then the target fee of $100,000, but reduced by 20% of the $100,000 cost overrun, resulting in an actual fee of $80,000. The actual price, the total amount paid by the buyer to the seller, is then the actual cost plus the actual fee, which totals $1,180,000. The actual profit is the actual fee of $80,000 divided by the actual cost of $1.1 million, or 7%. If you keep the contract terms the same, you can see what happens if the cost savings or cost overruns are even greater. If the actual cost is only $800,000, then the actual fee is $100,000 plus $40,000, which is 20% of the $200,000 cost savings, for a total actual fee of $140,000. The buyer's actual price paid is $1,040,000, which you'll notice is less than the target price, so that's nice. And the seller's actual profit is 17%. If, on the other hand, the actual cost is $1.2 million, that's $200,000 worth of cost overruns, and this hits the seller in reverse, reducing the actual fee by $40,000 to only $60,000, an actual profit of only 5%. Now we come to the point of total assumption. If you're worried about this one on the PMP exam, try to remember that even if you do see one of these questions on the exam, it's just one question among 200. Try not to let your worry about this one cause you to spend too much time on it and risk missing several other questions. Those others are each worth just as much as a single difficult question on something like the point of total assumption. That said, let's demystify this one. First of all, this applies only to fixed price incentive fee contracts. Next, recall that a fixed price incentive fee contract has a ceiling price. The buyer won't pay any more than that, no matter how high the costs go. The buyer will share a percentage of cost overruns, but not past the ceiling price. That's where it ends. Any cost overruns past that point are borne entirely by the seller. And that's what the point of total assumption means. It's when the actual price rises to the ceiling price and it stops there, even though costs can continue to rise after that. However, and this is the tricky part, the point of total assumption is not the actual price or ceiling price, even though it happens when they're equal. When that happens, there's an actual cost, which is still less than the actual or ceiling price, because there's still some profit in there. And it's that actual cost that is the point of total assumption. Let me say that another way. The point of total assumption is the actual cost at which the actual price equals the ceiling price, which is the point at which cost overrun sharing ends, which is where the seller assumes all additional cost overruns. It's not the point at which profit equals zero. That comes later. It may also help to consider that the point of total assumption is not something that the buyer ever needs to worry about. The buyer is focused on the ceiling price. It's the seller that's interested in knowing at what level of actual costs the seller loses the benefit of sharing cost overruns with the buyer. Now that you understand the concepts, here's the formula for calculating it. You may have to memorize this one, but understanding how it works will help you to remember it, or even to recreate it. But first, let's go through an example. Here's our familiar example of a fixed price incentive fee contract with all the same contract terms. Let's take a look at the formula. At the top, you have ceiling price minus target price. Why? Because this is the range of sharing cost overruns. The buyer has agreed to share cost overruns over the target price up until the ceiling price. Dividing by the buyer's share of the share ratio tells you how high the cost overruns can go before the buyer stops sharing the costs. Now you can just add this to the target cost, and you know how high the total actual costs will go before the buyer is done sharing them. And that's the point of total assumption. Now let's plug in the numbers. The ceiling price minus the target price is the range of cost overrun sharing, which is between $1.1 million and $1.3 million, or $200,000. Divide that by the buyer's share of the share ratio, or 80%, and you have $250,000 worth of cost overruns before the buyer stops paying for any more of it. Add this to the target cost of $1 million, and you have $1,250,000. Now we know that the point of total assumption happens when the actual price reaches the ceiling price. So we set actual price to $1.3 million. Subtracting the actual cost from this leaves the actual fee of $50,000 for an actual profit of 4%. Notice that the seller still made a profit, just not much of one. If the actual costs go any higher than this, then the seller's profit will drop quickly because the buyer will no longer share any of these additional cost overruns. In fact, if the actual fee at this point is $50,000, then that means that another $50,000 of cost overruns would completely wipe out the seller's profit, and any cost overruns past that would cause the seller to incur a loss on the project. This is a concept that may take some time to become comfortable with, so let's go through another example of the point of total assumption. we'll use slightly different contract terms. This time, the target fee is $200,000 instead of $100,000. This changes our target price to $1.2 million and reduces the range of sharing of cost overruns down to $100,000 because we still have the ceiling price of $1.3 million. Divide this $100,000 by the buyer's share of 80%, and you have $125,000 worth of cost overruns before the buyer stops paying anymore. Add this to the target cost of $1 million, and you have $1,125,000 of actual cost as your point of total assumption. We know that the point of total assumption happens when the buyer stops paying anymore, which is when the actual price equals the ceiling price. So we set the actual price to $1.3 million in order to calculate the actual fee of $175,000. Remember that the actual cost plus the actual fee is the actual price. Now, divide the actual fee by the actual cost to find that the actual profit is still a healthy 13%. Not the 20% that the seller had hoped for, but still a profit. And that's it for the point of total assumption. As we wrap up this lesson on procurement management documents, let's review what we've covered. It all starts with a procurement management plan, which is the rulebook or guidelines for how you'll manage procurement for your project. It should specify how you'll coordinate with your procurement department, as well as how you'll coordinate the project work between the seller and the project team. Roles, responsibilities, key stakeholders involved in procurement, schedules, milestones, metrics, and of course, assumptions, constraints, and risks related to procurement all go into the procurement management plan. The procurement strategy has three primary components: the delivery method, such as turnkey versus design build or design build operate and so on; the type of agreement, fixed bid, cost plus, or time and materials; and details of what the procurement phases are and what they'll be and how to move through these phases. Bid documents are of three primary types: the request for information, the request for quote, and the request for proposal. You also have source selection criteria, which can be quite elaborate and may make use of a multi-criteria decision-making matrix. The procurement statement of work is that portion of the scope baseline that is to be outsourced to the seller. Types of agreements include not only contracts, but also service level agreements, memoranda of understanding, memoranda of agreement, and purchase orders. We reviewed several of the different types of contracts and their variations, including variations on fixed price, cost reimbursable, and time and materials contracts. And we went over how to calculate the value of a fixed price incentive fee contract and how to calculate the point of total assumption. For more information about these procurement documents, you can refer to these pages in the PMBOK guide. And for more details on calculating the contract value and the point of total assumption of a fixed price incentive fee contract, you can check out this article online at the Defense Acquisition University. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.